En 3, 2, adelante.
Alô, muy buenos días a todos y a todos.
Good morning, everyone.
Antes de empezar, comento que la sesión tiene
Before
interpretación en español, inglés
we
y
begin, this
portugués.
session has interpretation into English, Spanish, and Portuguese. You must simply select the language you prefer on the bottom of the Zoom screen.
Please note that this session has interpretation available in Spanish, English, and Portuguese. You just have to select the language of your preference on the Zoom screen. E buenos dias, bom dia. Antes de começar, informo que para essa sessão estará disponível interpretação em espanhol, inglês e português, e podem escolher o idioma da sua preferência na janela Zoom embaixo. Bem-vindas e bem-vindos a quienes nos acompanham en el día de hoy.
We welcome those that accompany us today when we will present the study entitled Experiences Between the Private Sector and Indigenous Peoples in Latin America. This study was organized jointly by the Regional FAO Office for Latin America and the Caribbean, jointly with the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean, FILAC. My name is Duclair Sternert. I am an officer of alliances with NGOs of the regional office of the FAO, and I will be leading today's session. In this 1.5-hour session, we will share with everyone the analysis of some experiences that we have deemed to be outstanding between the private sector and indigenous peoples. Both sectors are aware both sectors are fundamental for the sustainable development of our region, but we also know that in historical terms, the relationship between these two have been characterized by an important lack of equality between different contexts and unequal conditions. This study is the result of some concerns. For example, we ask ourselves, are there experiences where private businesses and indigenous peoples can coexist in a collaborative and in collaborative fashion and in harmony? What is the context for good entrepreneurial practices, paying due respect to the ways of life of indigenous peoples in the region? What are the challenges, opportunities, and recommendations so that our region may have win-win situations, both for the business sector, but above all, for the indigenous communities? Well, these and other questions are the ones that we have tried to respond via the study that we are presenting today. We will begin by with some welcoming words, and subsequently we will also open up the floor for the comments of three guests so that we can, after that, hold a Q&A session involving all participants. So I would like I invite you to post your chats in the QA section of the Zoom platform. We will begin with the welcoming words of Mr. Mario Lubetkin, who is our regional director. No, sorry. General Subdirector and the regional representative of the FAO for Latin America and the Caribbean. He will convey a message, a recorded message, because he has been unable to be with us here today. So, colleagues, please run Mr. Lubetkin's video.
Autoridades y representantes de los gobiernos de América Latina.
Authorities and representatives of the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean, representatives of NGOs, the private sector, civil society, and the scientific and academic world. I especially greet the representatives of indigenous peoples. Participants all, it is truly a pleasure for me to speak to you at this event when we will present together with the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, a tremendously relevant study for the region. This is a significant milestone in the sphere of the knowledge and analysis of the relationships between key stakeholders of sustainable development and exploratory and innovating work at a regional level that opens up new perspectives about the relevance of the respect of the rights of indigenous peoples and their contribution to an inclusive and respectful development, respectful with the rights of all peoples. Historically, the relationships between indigenous peoples and private organizations have been asymmetric in nature, impacting the rights of indigenous peoples and highlighting the urgent need to establish equitable collaborations that pay due respect to their rights and strengthen them. At present, in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have more than 54 million indigenous men and women, which is equivalent to approximately 8.5% of the population of our region. In accordance with data of the International Labour Organization, approximately 30% of the indigenous peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean live in poverty, which increases twofold the probability of poverty compared to the non-indigenous population. The indigenous peoples face disproportionate challenges, despite the fact that they are widely acknowledged as fundamental partners in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. These strategies to provide support not always reflect their crucial role. Indigenous peoples face a greater risk of food insecurity and malnutrition, facing situations of greater vulnerability faced with the negative impacts of the increase in food prices or limited access to essential services. Over the past few decades, private companies in the region have experienced a significant growth both in territorial terms and in the production of goods and services. This growth has led to more complex and unequal relationships that have been explicitly recognized by governments in the region. In consequence, it is crucial to investigate, document, and disseminate experiences where the relationship between the private companies and indigenous peoples has been positive and innovating, with the purpose of promoting a more balanced and beneficial collaboration for both parties. I would like to thank the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean for conducting this study and on all the technical teams that have contributed with their dedication and experience in order to crystallize this successful project. I hope that this study will significantly contribute towards making headway in this direction. The FAO is open to collaborate in the joint design of additional spaces and initiatives related to this issue with multiple stakeholders. Please count on our permanent support in order to continue to support and collaborate with governments, institutions, and companies promoting a peaceful and respectful coexistence between peoples and the sectors involved in development. I summon everyone to work even with greater strength so that no one is left behind.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Se te cortó el audio, Duca.
Your audio is off. We can't hear you.
No, todavía. Ahora sí,
¿Aló?
ahora sí.
Now we can hear you.
Bueno, vou conhecer então esse microfone. Bueno, luego de los saludos del señor
Following the
Lubet,
greetings of Mr. Lubetkin, I would now like to offer the floor directly to Alberto. Alberto
el secretario
is the technical secretary of FILAC and who will today, in 15 minutes, present the results of that study. And after that, we'll move on to the comments of three guests. Alberto, may you be very welcome. Thank you for being with us here today. You have 15 minutes for your presentation, and when we have 3 minutes left, I will let you know. Thank you.
Ahí Alberto va a compartir su pantalla, ¿verdad?
Sí. Bueno, muy buenos días a todos y todas los presentes.
Good morning, everyone. As was mentioned by Duclair, now what I will do is to deliver a presentation related to this document that we worked on jointly with the FAO. And now I will be delivering my presentation. Please let me know if you can see the document on the screen.
¿Se puede ver?
Can you see it?
Ya, lo vamos a poner en
Yes, please
modo
put it in
presentación. A ver,
presentation
voy a acercar bien
mode.
para ponerlo en modo presentación igual. Ya, parece que ahí sí. Bueno,
Okay.
como bien ha dicho Duclair,
As was mentioned by Duclair, I would like to share with you the motivation behind this study. It is known that in historical terms, the relationship between indigenous peoples and private organizations has always been characterized by an asymmetric relationship, and that is one of the reason why FILAC throughout its history has promoted the creation of indigenous leaders in order to try to minimize those that asymmetry. We also find asymmetry in other aspects, and we will deal with that also. There is a quote that refers to the motivations behind this study, and that indigenous peoples have suffered historical inequality as a result of colonization, and because they have been dispossessed of their lands, territories, and resources, which has prevented them to exercise, especially the right to development in accordance with their needs and interests. Tomorrow we will be participating in a seminar in the Catholic University that speaks indeed about indigenous territories, and thus FILAC and the FAO decided to produce this document highlighting the positive aspects, and that leads us to reflect in different spaces of dialogue and analysis, and also to inspire the business sector that is now indifferent to this issue.
A bit
about the regional context. It is well known that there are roughly 60 million indigenous people in the region, 8% of the population. Many of them live in precarious economic situations, and it is known that roughly 30% of the indigenous people live in poverty, twice that of the other population. And they face more risk in terms of malnutrition and other negative aspects.
Contexto es decir que una proporción considerable de las personas indígenas viven en medio de una pugna constante entre
They
la
also live in constant conflict with regard to preserving their lifestyles and their cosmovision and their traditions and modern life. This involves facing challenges regarding development, industrialization, globalization. There's data from 2013. I'm sure it's changed significantly, but we have observed more than 100 conflicts regarding the extractive industry and indigenous peoples.
Fruto de justamente la motivación que ha tenido este estudio, el objetivo central tiene que ver con investigar y poner de relieve
is related to focusing on and highlighting distinguished experiences in the region regarding indigenous peoples and the private sector, a region that has traditionally been known for a great deal of symmetry, as mentioned earlier. We would also like to underscore the growing recognition of indigenous peoples' rights and their crucial contribution to sustainable development. Therefore, this study works towards incorporating new dimensions that reinforce the incidence of indigenous peoples, making them more symmetrical. Now, as mentioned earlier, several different experiences from 8 countries throughout the region were chosen to highlight different production sectors such as metal mining, non-metal mining, tourism, food, energy, culinary hydrocarbon in the sector, and in which indigenous peoples are negotiate with the private sectors, but they also participate as commercial partners, which is quite interesting. Now, we have also seen experience with the state has significant or different ranges of participation and influence with regard to reaching the agreements that have been drawn. So that's quite interesting. Now, there are also some cases in which the state is a regulatory authority, but as well as a participant protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. Therefore, we will show conclusions related to the role of these states in this relationship. So what methodology was used? Well, this is quite interesting. It's an exploratory effort, and we have talked about this with Declare, specifically with regard to the fact that this is the first of many different projects that will continue going forward. We have emphasized good practices that in many cases have involved free prior informed consent, resulting in very good results, in fact, as presented in this document. Allow me to show you a chart talking about how we developed this document. This will be available to you, so you can look at it in your free time in greater detail. First, we have the conceptual framework that was developed that includes existing legislation with regard to indigenous rights, establishing criteria and indicators for selecting the stakeholders involved in the most relevant cases. Interviews were carried out with a variety of different experts and organizations, and then information was gathered. All of the information gathered was organized, including available bibliographies, interviews, and then some conclusions were drawn. Now, with regard to the conceptual framework, we should say that this includes existing legislation with regard to the indigenous rights. Of course, ILO Agreement 169 and the Declaration of the UN with regard to indigenous rights dating back to 2007, the American Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights dating back to 2016, and what is crucial and related to which indicators have been drawn up are the guiding principles of the UN on human rights and companies dating back to 2011. This includes specifically indigenous peoples. There are several different elements there that we will be pointing out to you, and this has been helpful for conducting assessment of the ties between private sector and indigenous peoples. What are the UN guiding principles on human rights and the private sector or companies? Well, first of all, in order to secure sustainable development, including the economic, social, and cultural rights, is crucial. And these date back to the International Compact of the UN issued in 1976. Now, originally, these do not include the indigenous rights, but given that due diligence procedures are key components to respecting the compliance of this agreement, it is necessary to clearly identify and differentiate between the various interest groups. So protecting the progressive requirement of applying due diligence with regard to human rights has evolved, and this involves certain cases in which regulatory requirements by the countries have been imposed on transnational companies, including the protection of human rights. There's another important element here, and that is related to the selection criteria and the cases analyzed. There were 4 criteria. First, the geographic area. We struck a balance between countries in geographic areas. There were 8 countries involved, and then the different productive sectors were chosen as well. The productive sectors that had the greatest relationship or ties with indigenous people were chosen, and then also the indigenous peoples were selected in keeping with their relevance in terms of gender aspects, diversity, and language. And then with regard to the exclusion criteria, projects in which the companies had fallen into significant incompliance with the international regulations were not chosen. So FAO exclusion criteria were actually applied. What are the indicators that are based on the use of human rights principles. Well, there are 9. I wanted to summarize 4 because some of them are self-explanatory and other related to formal declarations by the private sectors, other with regard to human rights respect as well. Sometimes the companies have conducted a due diligence in keeping with the guiding principles. Some companies have carried out a risk mapping in keeping with the human rights of the indigenous peoples. Now, other companies actually have specific personnel that address the application of these principles. And then in other cases, the companies have move forward with mechanisms to secure the belonging and for complaints to be freely submitted by the indigenous peoples. Now, here we have a chart which is based on using these or the application of these guiding principles. Here we have Cerro Matoso in Colombia, and this company does comply with the principles, with the declaration, with public declarations, conducts due diligence, identifies the risks of negative impact on the human rights of indigenous peoples, does have prevention and mitigation measures, and does have personnel in charge of applying the guiding principles, and does have a complaint mechanism. So Cerro Matoso from Colombia meets all of the criteria mentioned. With regard to number 2, BHP Billiton in Peru, out of the 9 principles, this company complies with 2. If you would like, you can peruse the document at your own convenience, and the idea is to provide a summary of the compliance with the indicators. Now, the third case is Albemarle in Chile. They comply with 5 of the 9 principles, including formal declaration, public declarations, the identification of the risks related to the negative impacts of activities on the human rights of indigenous people, and the prevention and mitigation measures and complaint mechanisms. La Lote 192, Petro Peru in Peru, complies with 7 out of 9. Wakefield Cafeology in Colombia does not meet any of the criteria. And with regard to iCafe in Costa Rica, they meet 3 out of the 9. As you can see, the study conducted is quite diverse with regard to compliance with the indicators that are based on these human rights guiding principles. And with regard to the next slide and analyzing the rest of the cases, as I mentioned, there are 12 cases. The 7th case is De Mendes in Brazil. That company does not comply with any of the indicators, neither does Grupo AGE in Peru. Cervecería Boliviana Nacional in Bolivia does not comply with any of the 9. And with the Parque Eólico Fuerza Energía Limpia de Tizimín, that company only meets 1 criterion. And El Green Power Panama complies with 4 out of the 9. And in Guatemala, there is a tourism company that does not meet any of the 9 criteria either. So there are different degrees of compliance depending on the country and company. And so this document reflects upon how we can make progress with regard to the human rights of indigenous peoples. There's another aspect that was assessed, and that was indicators based on the relationship between the private sector and indigenous peoples in terms of working conditions, commercial ties, and other aspects. Here we have a chart that summarizes these relations with regard to labor relations. We can see in the case of Cerro Matoso in Colombia, the proportion of the community that actually works in the entity is 15%. That's quite high. There's another case of a company in which there are working ties, and that's Albemarle in Chile, where they do have formal written contracts involving specific
el 37%
clauses with regard to working with Indigenous peoples, and 37% of the Indigenous community members work at this company. And the level of qualification or skills required are matters with regard to which they are making progress, but there is a need to boost that. So I know I do not have much time. That's what I was told. So there needs to be a review conducted here with regard to the second company, with regard to iCafe in Costa Rica and
en el Green de Panamá,
Panama.
el 100% de la comunidad trabaja.
With regard to iCafe, there is no mention of the Indigenous people working there. With regard to NL Green, 100% of the Indigenous community work for the company, and the rest continues. With regard to commercial ties, iCafe Costa Rica is a raw material provider primarily. With regard to cafeology in Colombia, they are suppliers of finished products. And then the chocolate company De Mendes, they provide raw material, finished products, and they do have training for contractors. Now let's refer to
el origen de la relación. En muchos casos, si
the
usted
origin of the ties. In many cases, if you go over the case studies, you will see that there have been long-term conflicts within the territory regarding the companies and the Indigenous communities. For example, Cerro Matoso, Albemarle, Lote 192 from in Petro Peru, BHP Billiton in Peru. So it's necessary to review these cases where there have been conflicts between the companies and the communities. And as we were saying earlier with Duclair, it's very important to make progress with regard to new studies in order to figure out how the situation may be improved.
And in terms of relationships, well, they are quite visible, I would say. There are voluntary regulatory agreements, monitoring of agreements, the provision of regular information, and there are different cases depending on the type of business that we are discussing. Now, in order to conclude, we can say that out of the types of relationships of businesses with Indigenous peoples, there are labor-related relations, 5 cases. There is also trade relationships, 4 cases, and with regards to inhabitants of neighboring territories, there is business responsibility, 4 cases, and wherever there are agreements, we find 5 cases. Now, with regards to the conclusions, we can say that it is possible to establish win-win relationships. That is quite clear when we analyze these experiences. And anyone, whatever the origin, positive relationships have been built via a long process, where via dialogue we have established reliable trust relations between stakeholders. Wherever we have held consultations with prior consent and informed, we find more successful cases. Another conclusion is that at present there are favorable conditions for positive relationships between businesses and Indigenous peoples, and therefore that must lead us to be optimistic in terms of the fact that if we act properly, it is possible for the relationships to improve, bearing in mind the international legislation and making use of these instruments, Convention 169 of the ILO, the Declaration of UN Principles on the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we can achieve good results. And finally, among the conclusions from the viewpoint of businesses, the collaboration relationships with Indigenous peoples become increasingly an asset and a source of value for the business. And therefore, this is an issue that we undoubtedly must strengthen. This is a study, a first approach that has led to some recommendations for both businesses, where indeed businesses must become decisive stakeholders for sustainable development, entering into agreements with the Indigenous peoples and considering Indigenous communities as partners rather than beneficiaries. That is very important to leave aside this assistance-based perspective, but to acknowledge their rights, and based on that to strike agreements and strategies within companies and intercultural relations, the development of adequate due diligence processes that are effective, and to align purposes and entrepreneurial missions with the views of indigenous peoples. And finally, to consider joining these human rights principles with and other international instruments in order to achieve good results. In terms of recommendations for states, well, they must exercise a role as leaders and entities that safeguard compliance with international regulations, especially whenever there is more active participation. Results have been better, and also to conduct early development of consultation processes free and with prior consent. And this has been fundamental in successful cases, and we must analyze this in the document. And finally, recommendations for indigenous peoples, well, the construction of intercultural societies that favor more symmetric relationships, that is relies on all stakeholders, and here indigenous peoples, organizations, authorities, and leaders are required to include within their assets of incidence and interaction with the non-indigenous world the voluntary regulations and the requirements that they form part of the business world. And finally, for international entities, among them FILAC and the FAO, undoubtedly to move towards the mandatory nature of the enforcement of human rights principles between private companies and indigenous peoples. They must be increasingly binding and also expand the sphere of relationships between businesses and indigenous peoples towards their business experiences, and finally to hold to exchange experiences so that we can continue to delve deeper in experiences that may be positive, so that we can make headway in this relationship between stakeholders and indigenous peoples. And finally, to continue with the FAO with the effort to decisively support consultation processes, the human rights principles of among businesses and all international entities with regards food, agriculture, and agri-food systems. And as Technical Secretary of FILAC, please count on us for all these challenges that lie ahead. And the final recommendations, well, according to the experiences that we analyzed, we must consider that as a general rule, businesses that have come to the fore have not used all the human rights principles. That is clear, and therefore there is important scope in order to make headway. And another important weakness is that there is no protocol or document that supports a human rights policy, and therefore there are aspects that undoubtedly will give rise to new studies, and probably with the FAO and other entities that may be interested in this issue, well, we will be able to work on this so that we can move forward in the relationship between businesses and indigenous peoples. Thank you for your attention.
Cambia el micro, Duca.
¿Aló? Bueno, muchas gracias, Alberto.
Okay, thank you, Alberto.
Muchas gracias
Thank you for the
esfuerzo
effort of summarizing a study that has so much interesting and important information in only 5 minutes, that actually became 20 minutes. But this provides us with material so that we can establish a dialogue among all participants. Mirna Cunningham is with us. She is the first Vice President of FILAC. And so before I offer the floor to our three guests that will comment the study, I would like to warmly welcome our friend Mirna, who is always with us in the working with the FAO agenda, so that she could greet us on behalf of FILAC as first Vice President. Please go ahead, Mirna. Thank you for being with us. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for this presentation and the opportunity of being able to continue with this relationship between FILAC and the FAO, and now dealing with this very relevant issue, which is the relationship between the private sector and indigenous peoples. It is truly a pleasure to be here with you today representing FILAC. And I would like to thank those that have made this detailed analysis possible on the relationship between the private sector and indigenous peoples in our region. This type of reflection and dialogue, as clearly mentioned by our technical secretary, are fundamental in order to advance towards a construction of bridges that enable us to promote entrepreneurial practices that are more respectful and equitable in the territories of indigenous peoples. The study is highly relevant because it is what is important is this sphere and the business relationships and the state institutions and even international entities, but without being the first in this aspect, it is undoubtedly the most updated study with regards, because of the experiences it collects and because of the recommendations it issues. The document also, or the study also enables us to reaffirm the fundamental role of indigenous peoples. As we well know, our region houses more than 800 indigenous peoples, and each one has a richer cultural, social, political, and environmental diversity. However, our peoples face important challenges as a result of the increasing and often intrusive presence of private businesses within their territories that fail to comply with due diligence. That in the case of the indigenous people, the prior free and informed consent is a minimum, despite the fact that in many cases there is a business responsibility framework and guiding principles that should, in one way or another, safeguard the respect for human rights. In reality, we face many stresses, many tensions and conflicts in the region, and these conflicts have had a profound impact not only on the lives and the economies of indigenous peoples, but also uh, on their social structure, their cultural fabric, their environmental surroundings. And this is the factor that often leads to migration. Despite this difficult reality, we face a fundamental question. Can there be positive relationships between the private sector and indigenous peoples? Well, the answer to this question is the main focus, as mentioned by our technical secretariat. That is the main focus of the study that set out to identify and analyze collaboration experiences that have been deemed to be positive as from the perspective of indigenous peoples themselves. The purpose of the study has been to provide not only a clear vision of what has worked, but also to share lessons and recommendations that may become the basis for the development of more just and sustainable relationships in the future. This issue was tackled by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Affairs as from the 2022 session, where the forum reminded us via paragraph 22 that in order to ensure an effective implementation, the guiding principles on businesses and human rights must be aligned with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Convention 169 of the ILO, the Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation, and Justice in Environmental Affairs in Latin America and the Caribbean, known as the Escazú Agreement, and the wide-ranging jurisprudence of entities dealing with human rights. That it is absolutely vital for all of us to contribute to educate businesses so that they may understand that the respect for human rights, the protection of the environment, and the acknowledgement of the rights and the lives of indigenous peoples is not something that is negotiable, but rather a necessary condition for a virtuous and lasting relationship. Likewise, it is important that the outstanding experiences of positive relationships between the private sector and the indigenous peoples become examples so that an increasing number of businesses follow suit. Today, we have shared and will continue to share the results of this study, not only as a diagnosis of what has already been done, but rather an opportunity to crystallize a different future where indigenous peoples are not only recognized, acknowledged, and respected, but so that we may be able to build relationships for collaboration in equal conditions with the private sector under a framework of dialogue, cooperation, and respect. I am fully convinced that the results and recommendations that this study contributes are valuable. They are a valuable tool in order to strengthen cooperation between and collaboration between these two sectors, and in order to promote the development of good practices that not only respect but also enhance the rights and the way in which indigenous peoples live in our region. We're talking of fundamental rights such as free, prior and informed consent truly become the stepping stone for any process that impacts upon indigenous people. So once again, I would like to express my gratitude to the FAO for building and for continuing to contribute via these joint studies in this important task. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Mirna. Siempre
Thank
con
you,
palabras
Mirna,
tan
for your
sabias, iluminadoras
wise,
para nosotros.
inspirational
Y con eso,
remarks.
entonces,
With
abrimos
that,
la
I would
palabra
like
a
to
los tres invitados
give the floor
que
to the
estarán,
three
comentando el estudio
guests
en el día de
who
hoy.
will be remarking upon the study
Aprovecho
today.
para recordar que es un
I would
evento
also like to remind you that
público,
this is an
que,
event that
todos
is
los participantes
open
en
to the entire
esta
public,
ahora pueden ir
and
comentando, registrando sus
the
inquietudes,
participants present here today may
en la sección de
express
preguntas
their
y respuestas
comments,
del chat,
concerns,
o más bien en el chat de
questions
YouTube,
using
por los que
the
nos están
Zoom
acompañando por esta
platform
medio.
or the
Entonces,
YouTube chat
pasemos entonces
box.
con
Let us
Ricardo
begin
García.
with Ricardo Garcia.
Ok. Ya, vamos a adaptar aquí. Vamos entonces a
Rather,
pasar la
let's
palabra
make a
a
change
Gerardo
and give the floor to
Umi,
Gerardo Umi.
es secretario general
He is
de la
the General
Organización Nacional Indígena
Secretary
de
of
Colombia,
the
UNIC,
National
y
Indigenous
también hace parte del Consejo
Organization of
Directivo
Colombia.
de FILAC,
He is
también
also
Colombia.
a member of the
Gerardo,
Colombian
bienvenido.
FILAC
Muchas
Committee.
gracias
So
por estar con
welcome,
nosotros.
Gerardo, and thank you for joining
Te
us.
paso la palabra. Tiene 5 minutos.
You have 5
Y cuando
minutes
falte uno,
for your remarks, and when you have one left, I will let you know. Go ahead.
Muchas gracias a usted y
Thank you,
saludo
and
fraternalmente
greetings,
a la
warm
Mirna
greetings
Cunningham,
to Dr.
doctor
Mirna
Alberto
Cunningham,
Pizarro,
to
igualmente a
Alberto
los
Pizarro,
amigos
and
de la FAO por
our
facilitar,
FAO
por
friends for
contribuir con
having
este estudio
facilitated this
que nos
study and
socio
for having contributed to this study. You are a key partner for our
FILAC.
intergovernmental organization, FILAC.
Yo quería señalar como en dos tópicos
I would like to
en el
refer to
comentario
2
en
topics
esta
as part of my
en
remarks
este estudio. El primero,
relative to the study.
nos parece
First of
muy
all,
importante y de
we
pronto voy
believe
a retomar
it is very
lo que la
important,
doctora
and
Mirna
perhaps I will go
Cunningham
back to
acaba
what
de decir,
Dr. Mirna
y
Cunningham just
también el
mentioned,
secretario
and also
técnico
our
ya lo señaló,
technical
que tiene que ver
secretary has also
con
referred to this, and
colaboración
I'm referring to
segura
how
e informada. Y también hemos
prior consent should
enfatizado
be
muchas
free and
veces que
informed.
se debe lograr
On many
el
occasions, we have
consentimiento.
emphasized
Pero en este
that
concepto de
consent
Mirna
should be
y mis
secured.
amigos de la
But
FAO, yo quisiera
Mirna
introducir
and the 2 FAO
un
members
concepto
have
casi que como denuncia.
referred to this concept, but allow me to
A mi modo de ver, creo que
include another
todos,
concept, which is
inclusive hasta las mismas
perhaps
organizaciones, nos
even
hemos
a complaint.
equivocado
And I
en que las
think
consultas
the way I view
previas
it, most
se
of
vienen
the
realizando
organizations have made a
en
mistake.
cada
We have made a
comunidad
mistake in
localmente
that the process is carried out individually with each indigenous community. But you know that, for example, the Aymara people or the Quechua people are not just made up of one community, but many communities in different territories, but they belong to a single nation or a single peoples. And so when Felipe mentioned, when the consultative process is being carried out with a community, that community participates in a disadvantaged fashion. It's an asymmetrical, disadvantageous relationship for them. And on many of the occasions, a majority of the occasions, with companies and with governments, the indigenous peoples are not necessarily partners, but rather they benefit from compensation, and that's different. They are beneficiaries of compensations for structural or spiritual damage and organizational damages that the other parties have caused. Now that is different from a relationship in which the indigenous peoples participate as partners, as business partners or shareholders, if that is what the indigenous peoples decide. But in order for the peoples to be further developed and have the organizational technical capacity, as Mirna mentioned, one needs to help them and set up this installed capacity in the indigenous peoples, communities, and organizations. Otherwise, the success rate will be 0.001%, and the relationship will always be asymmetric, where the indigenous peoples are at a disadvantage and are not treated as partners, but instead as beneficiaries of compensation. So I just wanted to put forward that idea that the prior consent process should be carried out with not just a single community, but the entire indigenous community, because it's not just in the event of harm or damage, it's not just a single community that will be damaged, or the other way around. If they are subject to benefits, the idea is that the entire indigenous community benefit and not just a single group within that community, because that's in keeping with their concept of collective group concept. Now,
el convenio 169 de la OIT,
the ILO Agreement 169 refers to indigenous peoples, and I think that we, the organizations, as well as multilateral organizations and states, have made a mistake in which we have broken down that concept. We have distorted that concept, and that has been detrimental to the indigenous peoples who have been treated and addressed individually as local communities under these asymmetrical relationships. The other point, and with that I would like to finish, here in Colombia, there's an individual, Francisco de Rú, who was an activist priest who had a very developed mindset, and he referred to how if in a region the economic benefits of the company do not reach the region, there's no such thing as development. And so it's important to ensure that the community participates as a key actor with the ability to make decisive decisions, and may actually participate in the dividends, in the profit. And one of the principles of the World Bank is that there should be shared benefits, that the states and the private sector are quite reluctant to add that to their chip, to their institutional memory. They don't have that as part of their concept. And the study conducted by FAO and FELAC is very important
con esta versión, sino que se pueda seguir
in
haciendo
that
otros estudios, Alberto
it
y
may
doctora
be
Milena,
the foundation, the first step
ampliar y buscar más
for other
casos, porque
studies,
todos
and we
esos
could
indicadores,
expand
no lo son
the,
también, pues
the
para no negar los
approach,
los
include
que han
other
sido. ¿Por
cases.
qué es importante saber eso? Pues porque hay que tomar correctivos y
It's
porque hay
important
que,
to take
digamos,
corrective action
incentivar para que los
and
pueblos indígenas, toda vez que tomen alguna decisión
provide
de
incentive
participación,
to the
puedan
indigenous
tomar en
peoples
condiciones
to,
de
when
mejor
they
preparación
participate, to
política
provide
de
them incentive
protección,
to
de
have better
participar
participatory capacity
actores,
as
como
key
socios de los beneficios y los
partners and
proyectos.
actors and
Entonces, con este
in the
comentario,
benefits
pues,
and the
¿no?
projects.
Agradeciendo este esfuerzo
With
y
that,
esta
I would
invitación,
like to
invitarlos, pues,
conclude and
a
thank
hacer
you
este
for
comentario. Espero
having
que el
invited
tiempo
me to be here
haya
today.
pasado.
I hope I have not overgone my time limit. Thank you, Gerardo. You went slightly over, but that is fine. Thank you for your remarks today. I would like to now move on with the second guest speaker, Ricardo Garcia. He's the General Director of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of the Ministry of Culture. And he's also a council person, government council person for Peru on FELAC. Welcome, Ricardo. Thanks for joining us here today. We would like to hear your comments regarding the study, and you have 5 minutes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking you for the opportunity to speak here today. Ricardo, we cannot hear you all that well. Can you hear me better?
Un poquito mejor. A ver.
A ver ahora, ¿mejor?
Un poco mejor. Ya, adelante.
Somewhat better.
A ver, no sé si me escucha bien, pero bueno. En todo caso, en principio agradecer la
Again, allow me to
oportunidad para poder comentar
thank you for having the opportunity to comment upon this relevant publication. Thank you to Alberto and thank you to the speaker before me.
Bueno, primero sobre la publicación, creo que es
First of all,
importante
regarding the
remarcar algo
publication, I think it's important to
intercambiario o intercultural,
underline
¿no? Y es la
aspects, for
relación
example,
entre
intercultural
el
dialogue and the
privado,
ties
los
between
pueblos
the
indígenas.
public,
Creo que
private sector and the indigenous peoples.
revisando una de las publicaciones, tenemos una de
When
las
reading
experiencias,
the
creo que
publication,
más
I
interesantes
think
en
it's
Perú en torno al lote de
clear that
1
Peru has
es por
had many interesting experiences regarding FPIC. And the previous speaker said something interesting. For example, the dialogue between the indigenous peoples and the state and the private sector
fue
have
realizada por cuenca, ¿no? Por
been
pueblos.
carried out
En este caso, Quechua, por ejemplo, la comunidad o el
on
pueblo
a
indígena
watershed
Quechua,
basis, on a
de la
community
cuenca del
basis.
río Tigre,
And the
por ejemplo,
Quechua group from
tenía
the
solamente en
Tiger
torno a 9
River Basin
comunidades que
had
estaban
8 to
involucradas en
9
el ámbito
communities
petrolero,
that were
pero en México se
involved
dialogaron
in
con
the
30
oil
comunidades
industry,
que
but
dialogaban
in
en el bloque y
total, there
tomaban
were
decisiones
30
en bloque.
communities
Creo
that
que ese
discussed the
tipo de
issue as a
diálogo
block
es
and made
saludable
decisions on a
y se
block
resalta
basis. So
en
I think it's important to
proceso porque justamente
point
creo
that
que
out. And
uno
this
de
is a
los
healthy
beneficios
dialogue because I think one
relacionados
of
con
the benefits related
el
to
artículo 15 y
Agreement
15 de los beneficios
169, Article
de
15,
los recursos
which
naturales
is related to the direct benefit of
¿no? Las
natural
poblaciones de los
resources,
15 han sido el
can be
3.75%
reflected in that.
de la
The
producción
indigenous
fiscalizada,
communities
¿no? Y esto
have
se ha visto
enjoyed
reflejado en proyectos de desarrollo de las mismas, ¿no? Creo
0.75%
que
of the
de
uh,
esas dos experiencias que se
unregulated
han
production. So
publicado, creo que hay un rol importantísimo que se debe cumplir
the
del
two
Estado, que es
cases
como garante de
published
los derechos
show
colectivos de los
that
pueblos
the
indígenas,
state
¿no?
must play a
Y
key
que
role as a
justamente la
guarantor
implementación de
of
esos
indigenous
derechos
people's rights
en
in
el
terms of
contexto
implementation and
tenemos
supervision. In Peru, for example,
muchos acuerdos de consulta que
there are
todavía están en
many
proceso de cumplimiento y otras que
consultation
todavía no se
agreements that are in the process
Creo
of
que
being
ahí entra
complied
un
with and
rol
others that have not been.
importantísimo del
So
Estado para
the
poder
role of the state
garantizar que
is crucial
justamente
here
esos acuerdos
in trying to ensure that
puedan
the prior
se entiende que son productos de un
consent
diálogo
processes
intenso,
are
un diálogo
complied with. We know
intercultural
that
entre
these are the
pueblos indígenas,
that these
en
involve
este caso el Estado
a great deal of discussion and
presente para
debate,
poder
and so it's important
garantizar
for the
esa
state to
relación
ensure that these
entre
agreements are complied
pueblos
with
indígenas.
to
Efectivamente,
guarantee a fair relationship between the indigenous peoples and the private sector. Of course, there are many challenges in terms of natural resource protection, environmental challenges. I don't think the report underscores the impact, environmental impact that has affected the indigenous peoples. We from the Ministry of Culture believe that natural resource exploitation is crucial for economic development, but it needs to be compatible with environmental sustainability and resource protection. So we also know that it's important to focus on value creation for indigenous people. The publication also talks about something crucial, which is related to creating value for the indigenous people. We have seen how some initiatives have been able to involve the indigenous peoples in the development chain, in the production chain. For example, the indigenous people in the National Pacaya-Samil Reserve. There's a very interesting relationship there with the AG group. It's related to energy drinks, super drinks, and this is involving the guaje, which is a very crucial nutrient, a fruit in the Amazon region, good in terms of vitamin D and beta-carotene. And so this private company has worked with the indigenous group in this area. I think it could be a good example for the region as a way to draw on positive experiences. It's a good example of how the indigenous peoples have been involved in the value chain. We believe it is, and actually we were talking about this the other day, we think it's crucial to include the indigenous peoples, but on the basis of recognizing their traditional know-how and recognizing the potential that they have, and this intercultural dialogue and territorial approach is crucial with regard to development policies. I think that the Peruvian state has made a commitment to continue developing public policies regarding this topic. And in closing, I think this publication is it showcases good experiences between private companies and indigenous peoples, but at the same time places the state at the heart of a major challenge, the challenge of being a bridge, and to reinforce a relationship that in the end would benefit the indigenous peoples. And those are my remarks. Thank you. Again, I would just like to commend FAO and FELAC for their efforts. I believe these experiences may be helpful for other indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. You also contribute supplementary and different aspects, different to what Gerardo said. And now that we're running somewhat late, we will directly move on to the last guest. That last guest is from ECLAC. We would like to invite Felipe Correa then to take the floor. He works in the productive development and entrepreneurial development division of ECLAC. Thank you, Felipe, for being with us here today. We will be very attentive to your studies, to your comments on the study. Thank you very much, and you have 5 minutes for your comments. Thank you, colleagues from the FAO. I would also like to thank FELAC for developing this study. As from ECLAC, of course, we have always had a commitment, we have always been committed with sustainable development, paying due attention to the indigenous peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean in order to measure their contribution with statistics produced by CELADE, our population division, and at the same time paying and also being very attentive of the private sector because they can lead to the increase in productivity, innovation, the increase of revenues, and all this is closely related to the participation of the private sector. When it comes to this development, I would like to first of all say that whenever we talk about development, as from ECLAC, integral development, of course, the issue of indigenous people peoples comes up in an almost natural fashion, because if indigenous peoples have a conception that in some countries is called vivir bien or buen vivir,
que está muy alineado en su filosofía con lo que
that
nosotros
is very
consideramos el
aligned with the
desarrollo
philosophy
de pueblos
the philosophy of how we view the
tiene
development
atención
of
por el desarrollo
Latin
sostenible, por
America,
el cuidado del
and
medio
that
ambiente,
pays
por
due attention to sustainable development,
por el
to
cuidado de los
caring for the
espacios
environment,
comunitarios que también
and to caring
significa
for
ecosistema
communities, that
es un
in the indigenous
elemento principal.
thinking and ethics is indeed
Y en fin, por una
a
ética del
fundamental
desarrollo
aspect. And at
también
the end of the day,
fortalecer la
with an
filosofía
ethics
indígena
of
a
development
través de
that
la
is present in
sostenibilidad
indigenous
social,
philosophy and also
el
present
desarrollo
in
como
the philosophy
fundamento
of
del desarrollo.
development as we
Entonces,
understand it
este espacio
in
para
ECLAC,
dialogar
and therefore
sobre
this
el sector
space
privado y
to
pueblos
establish
indígenas
a dialogue about
muy
the private
oportuno,
sector and the indigenous people is
además porque
very
integra el
timely,
tema
because it also
indígena del
links
private
the
sector
indigenous
privado, que para
issue with
nosotros
the issue of the private
muy
sector
importante, el sector
that
privado como
is
dinamizador
very
de la
important for
economía,
us. The private sector
catalizador de la
as
innovación, del
a
progreso
boost of
técnico,
industry,
del
of development,
desarrollo,
of
de la
technical
experiencia de la historia económica
progress.
que
We know as a
el
result
intento
of
de
the
generar
history of
desarrollo y generar economía sin el
as a
sector
result of
privado
economic
no
history, if we
generalmente
are
no
to
ha
promote the economy
sido
without the private
muy
sector,
exitoso.
well,
Al
those
mismo tiempo
experiences have
sabemos
not
que
been very
hay
successful. At the same
opciones de
time,
accesos del
we
sector
know that in
privado
some cases,
o directamente
the
hechos
private
que
sector
contravienen la
has
tradición de los países, las buenas prácticas
acted
del desarrollo,
undermining
pero ese sector privado
the good
realmente lo
practices
tenemos
of development
desarrollado.
and the
Entonces es
regulations
muy
in each country.
importante
But without the private
pensar
sector,
cómo
we have
se
no
dialogar
development. And therefore, it's very important
la
to
importancia del sector
establish a dialogue
privado con la importancia
that highlights the
de
importance of the private
la
sector and
participación
the
y
importance
del
of
protagonismo del pueblo
participation and of the key role played
Ahora,
by
respecto al
indigenous
sector privado,
peoples. And
este es
now,
muy
with regards to the
heterogéneo.
private sector, well, the
En el
private sector
informe
is very
se dan
heterogeneous.
cuenta de algunas
The
experiencias
study
frente a grandes empresas del
reflects on
sector
certain
privado, pero por
experiences
cierto, las
by
grandes
major
empresas
companies
contribuyen con el
in the
solo
private sector. But I would like to
20%
remind you that
del empleo
large
en el
companies
país.
only contribute
Solo el
with
20% del
20% of
empleo está
employment in
concentrado en
Latin
el
America.
privado.
Only
El
20% of
80% del
employment
empleo privado
is
está en
produced
las
by
pequeñas
private sector.
y medianas
80% of
empresas,
employment
que
is in
también son
small and
sector privado.
medium-sized enterprises and also belong to
Bueno,
the
dentro de
private
este
sector.
sector privado
And within this private
de menor
sector,
tamaño hay agricultura, hay turismo, hay comercio por
the
menor,
smaller private
hay
sector, we
servicios de
have
consultoría.
agriculture,
Sería interesante
small-scale
también poder
trading,
poner
and so on.
en perspectiva la
And
relación
therefore,
de
it would be
pueblos
important
indígenas con el sector privado
to establish a
de menor
relationship
tamaño que
between the
tienen
indigenous peoples
un
and
diálogo mucho más
the
frecuente
private sector,
con
but different
con la
sized
población indígena
private
por
sector
las
businesses
comunidades indígenas.
that generate adequate
También me
relationships
parece
with indigenous
importante,
peoples.
a
Another
partir
important
de la
point,
lectura que hicimos del
based
informe,
on
es
our reading of
reconocer
the
que,
study, is
y
to
como lo reconoce el
acknowledge,
informe también,
and
así como
has
reconocen
acknowledged
en
by the
principio
study,
empresas
as a
indígenas
result of their
que podrían
recommendations,
conceptualizarse como
indigenous
ejemplos de economía indígena
companies
que tienen
that
su
could be
proyecto nacional
conceptualized as indigenous
y trabajamos desde la denominación de
businesses,
economía social y
as
solidaria
indigenous economies.
o
We
desde
talk
la
of
denominación de
social
economía
solidarity
comunitaria,
economies or the
como es el
creation
caso de
of
la economía
community
popular
economies,
boliviana, la
such as the
economía
Bolivian plural economy
comunitaria
and the
reciente
popular
en
and
Colombia.
community
En
economy
estos casos
that has
también
developed recently in
presumimos
Colombia.
que
And
los mismos
therefore, all
indígenas
these cases of
participan dentro del
indigenous
sector privado
communities that
y por
also
qué no,
form part of
no
the private
considerarlas
sector,
son
and why not
son
consider
elementos
them as
también
such, are
a
elements
explorar como nuevas formas
that
empresariales,
need
como
to be
empresas de
explored as
economía,
new business
como empresarios
formulas,
para un
as
buen
new
vivir.
type
¿Por qué no?
businesses or
También
businesses for buen
quiero
vivir.
traer
Why not?
a colación las palabras recientes de
And,
Gerardo Jumi,
and I
que
would like to
mencionó
refer
que
to the
está
words of
evaluando
Gerardo
elementos principales del
Jumi in the sense
desarrollo
that well-being is
ese
one of the main
incremento del
elements of
bienestar lo que
development.
caracteriza el
It
desarrollo.
is the increase of
Entonces, ¿por qué también no pensar
well-being that characterizes
empresas que
development? And
respondan
why not think of these
desde
companies
las economías
aimed at well-being as from the
Así que bueno,
economies, from
finalizando
these types
simplemente
of
para
economies?
no
And
evadir el tiempo
to
debido,
round up,
me parece un informe muy valioso que
I
trae
believe that this is
recomendaciones
a
muy
very
valiosas
valuable
de
study
la
that
cual se
has
pueden
very
derivar
valuable recommendations
diversas líneas de investigación.
from which,
Reconocer que es principal
and
también
we can continue,
el
and I
esfuerzo,
can
como dice el
trigger
informe,
different lines of
para seguir contribuyendo a
research. So you
pensar
can
este
count on
tipo
ECLAC
de
so that
estudios
we may
y de
continue to
generar
think
nuevos
about
conocimientos.
these
Muchas gracias.
studies and develop this framework of knowledge. Thank you.
Felipe, por
Thank you,
colocar também à
Felipe,
disposição
for
desse panel e, outra
also
vez, um eventual
expressing the
retorno
willingness of
hacia
ECLAC
novos espaços
and the contribution of ECLAC towards new studies, events, and studies that could emerge as a result of this contribution. I would now, if you have comments and or questions, please post them in the chat. We have already received 2 questions for FILAC, so I will ask them now in view of time. Alberto, the question is, what do you feel should be the role of the UN system when it comes to the promotion of positive relationships between the private sector and indigenous peoples, bearing in mind the fundamental role played by government as a guarantor of the right to free, informed, and prior consultations. And we also have another question. And now that you have that the study has been produced, what are the next steps that will be taken by FILAC? Have you thought of using that in other spaces or in the dialogue that you establish with the private sector? Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your questions. And I would also like to thank our first Vice President of FILAC, Myrna Cunningham, for her words that lead us to find new perspective in the study. Our brother Gerardo Jumi, member of the Council of FILAC, and Ricardo Garcia, and also Felipe Correa. I truly liked the words that you mentioned about the indigenous economy, which is a fundamental aspect of FILAC that was ratified during the last assembly, and the directive council that we held in Colombia last week. Now, with regards to the questions, well, there's a lot to do still by all UN agencies and by international entities such as FILAC in order to promote the fact that the individual and collective rights of indigenous peoples be respected by businesses. And one has to do with the generation of evidence, with sharing good practices. 2 experiences are outlined here that were chosen precisely because despite the fact that many of them began as a result of conflicts lasting 30 or 40 years, were able to be positively resolved because we established a dialogue indeed. And here I would like to thank the offer of Felipe Correa from ECLAC in terms of collaborating with us. Undoubtedly, generating knowledge, the generation of evidence, and of precise information of what is happening in territories helps undoubtedly to exert influence upon governments so that they may understand the important role that governments have to play in order to generate conditions so that we can enter into effective and symmetric dialogues between indigenous peoples and businesses with the active participation of governments as guarantors or as entities that safeguard compliance with these rights. Whenever final recommendations are made, there are recommendations for businesses. We also provide recommendations for indigenous peoples and for international entities, and certainly for governments and states. In consequence, this is an issue that must be analyzed from all perspectives so that we can indeed respect the territorial rights of peoples. We know that the history of our territories has to do with the theft of territories, often as a result of extractive activities and not always comply with international entities. But what we have wanted to highlight in this case are those situations where we have indeed been able to enter into a symmetric dialogue and where we have where interesting agreements have been struck with the active participation of indigenous peoples, not only in labor-related aspects, but also from the viewpoint of decision-making and the share of profit. There are several cases, a case of Aldemar, for example, where we have where they have a share of 3.5% of annual sales, not even of the profit. In other countries, they also have an important share of the profit of companies, and therefore we believe that that is the right road ahead to enter into a dialogue, to have the free, prior and informed consent, and of course the indigenous peoples where we have extractive operations, that they are able to receive the benefits of that of those economic activities. We believe that that is a road ahead with due respect for the rights of indigenous peoples, and therefore as FILAC we are committed together with the FAO and with all the other agencies that we work with, informally, so that we can collaborate, so that this can continue to happen and to exert influence, as though that the good steps are, the positive steps are highlighted and hopefully replicated. Thank you. Thank you, Alberto. We haven't received any more questions, and therefore we will now move on directly to listen to the words of Luis Carlos Wedowski. Luis Carlos is our regional officer working with policies, and he will also make some final comments about this study. Luis, you have the floor. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to greet you, Alberto, Felipe, Gerardo, Milna, Ricardo. It's a great pleasure to listen to you all. I would like to very quickly mention or bring to the fore 3 or 4 points. The first one, and based on what I have heard and based on my reading of the document, there is an issue, and that issue is that collaboration between members of a society is a basic principle that is fundamental when it comes to trust and transparency. For a long time, and you highlighted this, the dynamics between the indigenous peoples and the private sector has been permeated by that tremendous asymmetry of information and and mistrust based on historical processes that date back to the colony period and to the establishment of modern states. And the study shows that social processes, economic processes, power forces are dynamic and ever-changing. And over the past 30 years, changes have been created, new commitments, adjustments to the way in which the private sector relates with the indigenous peoples. And I would like to highlight that that is primarily the result, to a large extent, the persistence of the resistance and the capability of dialogue that indigenous peoples themselves have had. And it's important to highlight that. And the study highlights that dynamic as my colleagues have expressed. And that study shows some of these flagship cases, lessons learned, and upon that we must continue to build collaboration between indigenous peoples and the private sector, involving the participation of the state as a regulator, and they are all very important when it comes to the transformation of our agri-food systems towards a better production, better nutrition, better environment, and a better life for everyone.
Do no harm.
So going from do no harm to full collaboration among parties is a major challenge for the indigenous peoples and the private sector, as well as for society at large. And the right to free, prior, and informed consent as a legal, highly relevant mechanism may be viewed as a basis for a foundation for building more prosperous, harmonious societies and relations where no one is left behind. So for FAO, it has always been a pleasure to work closely with FELAC and the regional office, and we would like to thank you for the opportunity to comment on this relevant study. Thank you, Luis, for your remarks. I believe that the study now has been officially formally launched. I do not think we have wrapped up our discussion, though, on these issues. The document does, though, point out something that we all need to see. As Luis mentioned, we as a society may build more positive relationships between the private sector and the indigenous peoples. Allow me to underscore 4 or 5 issues that were brought up today during our discussion, because they are important, and not all of these are entirely explicit in the document. It was mentioned, I think it was Gerardo who mentioned this, that it's not just about understanding the indigenous peoples as beneficiaries of compensations, but It's about respecting their livelihoods and their lifestyles and foster these.
La importancia
The importance of dialogue was underscored and the groundwork necessary for said dialogue and greater consultation with the indigenous peoples. Moreover, here, many mentioned the role and the important role of states as the guarantor of the indigenous peoples' rights. And so means to balance out or even out the playing field, I guess you could say, in the territories. Felipe referred to the wealth of diversity and variability in the private sector. This is not quite minor, one could say. We know that in the private sector, there are many different types of companies, sizes of companies with different philosophies. There are some organizations such as cooperatives that are also engaged in the social or sector. That's important to bear in mind. And then the international agreements and guidelines are crucial for all of us. But at the same time, we all know that we are dealing with individuals. And if the companies have the opportunity to make use of these tools, and if they are more flexible and willing to engage in positive dialogue, there's much more potential here to make progress with regard to transforming the agri-food systems and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples. And then finally, last but not least important, most of the experiences that we have seen here today have referred to or have highlighted the need to recognize the persistence and resistance of the indigenous peoples in defending their own rights and advocating for their own rights. That is crucial. And we need to have a well-prepared approach when engaging the private sector and the indigenous peoples together. I hope this study, I expect this study will be a contribution to having more virtuous ties in the future between the private sector and indigenous peoples. We have been joined on the Zoom and YouTube channel by more than 100 individuals. Moreover, I would like to let you know that the study will be translated into English very soon for greater publication or for greater audience, a wider audience. And we will continue working towards our goal so that we can have a more sustainable future for better production, better nutrition, better environment, and a better life without leaving no one behind. So enjoy your afternoon and greetings to all.
Saludos.